Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak about the National Labor Relations Board and the reforms that have been proposed, a new rule. And I rise, first of all, to provide by way of a predicate or background what happened in 1935 when the National Labor Relations Act was passed. A lot to talk about in that act, but just like when a major piece of legislation passes, we have findings that undergird the statute itself. I won't go through all those today, but I think some of the language in there is especially appropriate for what we're talking about. The findings, in summary, spoke to the benefits of collective bargaining, the benefits of organizing and collectively bargaining, and asserted at one point very early in the statute, in the findings, the first couple paragraphs of the findings, that experience, and I'm paraphrasing this, but I'll get to specific words in a moment, but experience has shown that collective bargaining and organizing, quote, and these are the exact words, safeguards commerce from injury, impairment, or interruption, unquote. Goes on to talk about why it was better, or why they believed it was better, to pass a statute to resolve labor management disputes instead of the old way, which was constant conflict, constant fighting, and in some cases even violence. So we did the right thing in 1935 as a country, and we've had some history since then to draw upon. The National Labor Relations Board, of course, is the entity that gives meaning to what we intend when we pass laws like the National Labor Relations Act. And now we're having a dispute here in this body and in the other body as well about what these rules ought to be. What are the rules that govern the National Labor Relations Board, but in particular, what are the rules that govern elections? And with all of the challenges that we're facing in the country right now, the middle class has nowhere near recovered from the last and the Great Recession. Wages have been declining over a generation, or at least not increasing at the level that costs have been increasing. So with all that pressure on families, you would think this could be an area of common ground, but it's not. And so with all those challenges facing middle-class families, it's disappointing that Republicans in the Senate have chosen to focus on rolling back the National Labor Relation Board's modest and common sense reforms to help workers get a seat at the table so they can increase their wages and their economic security. Now, Democrats are fighting to increase wages, and we're also fighting for economic security. At the same time, Republicans seem to be constantly fighting to increase corporate profits while making workers pay the price. All of us, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, should be coming together to expand workers' voice at the table and not attacking workers' rights to collectively bargaining. So we're talking about something fundamental here, the opportunity to have an election in a workplace and the benefits that flow from that. And that's really about empowering workers. And I believe that's one of the reasons why we passed the National Labor Relations Board, National Labor Relations Act, not just to have a board that could settle disputes, but to actually empower workers in ways they hadn't been empowered up to that point in our history. So empowering those workers is an important part of building a stronger economy that works not just for those individual workers in that work site, but an economy that works for all families, not just the wealthiest few. When workers have a seat at the bargaining table, our economy prospers and the middle class thrives. I've always believed that if we didn't have unions and collective bargaining and organizing since World War II and even since the 30s, we'd have a much less robust middle class. Some people believe there would not be a middle class, but I'm at least willing to assert that the right to organize and collectively bargaining is not just good for that worker and his or her family, but it's also good for the economy as well, because those workers are the ones that drive the economy, not just the work that they do, but the expenditures they make on behalf of their family. So even though workers are more productive in the United States than ever before, workers are still struggling with those stagnant wages. And today, the middle class accounts for the smallest share of the nation's income since World War II. Hard to believe that the middle class has been so devastated. We know from our history that when workers have a voice in the workplace through collective bargaining, wages increase, workplace safety improves, and workers have increased retirement and health security. All of these benefits have helped grow America's middle class. Labor unions help workers share in that economic prosperity that they've helped to create through their own hard work. You know, one of the great moments that I've had as a senator from Pennsylvania is when you go to a manufacturing plant and they take you on a tour. I'm sure the presiding officer has done this a number of times. And they take you on the tour not just to show how they're producing something, how they're manufacturing, they're making something, but they're also very proud of the way they interact with and relate to and work with their employees. And they go out of their way to point to a bulletin board or point to a data point in their record to say we have very few injuries or 0 injuries in a certain period of time. They take great pride in that because they know that if they have fewer injuries, they're going to be more productive. If they have fewer injuries, they're going to have employees that can produce on their behalf. One of the reasons that they have fewer injuries over time in our economy and in those businesses is because workers have rights. Workers have rights they didn't have in the early part of the 1900s. So we know from our history that this works, this process of making sure that workers have a seat at the table. Now let's go to the National Labor Relations Board, their election reforms. These particular reforms make modest, but I would argue very important, updates to both modernize and streamline the election process to prevent delays and reduce litigation. The current system is vulnerable to litigation that will drag out for a long period of time, drag out the election process and put workers' rights on hold. These reforms will reduce unnecessary litigation that aren't relevant to the outcome of the election. In the past, employers and unions had to send information about the election process through the post office, which would cost time and money. The new rule brings this election process into the 21st century, which is 15 years old now, 21st century by letting employers and unions file forms electronically. I think that's the least that could happen. You would think that in this era we're living in, when everything is done, most everything is done electronically, in banking and in other industries, that at a minimum we should have information transmitted about an election, something valuable in a workplace. We hold elections with great regard, and we believe in the sanctity of elections. So the least we could do is make sure that those workers have the benefits of something that would transmit the information electronically. So sending that information in that fashion makes all the sense in the world. The rule also allows the use of modern forms of communication through cell phones and emails. That's not asking too much, to be able to transmit information to prepare workers for an election by the use of email or cell phones. The reforms are common sense steps to make sure that the NLRB, the board, is using its taxpayer dollars efficiently and effectively. Now these changes, as I referred to earlier, aren't just good for workers. They also help businesses by streamlining the whole process, the elections process in this case. Right now, the election process varies from region to region, Streamlining the process will provide both certainty for employers and workers themselves. The new rule allows businesses and unions to file forms electronically, as I mentioned, instead of using postage. This will save everyone time and money. So modernizing, this is what we're talking about here, modernizing election rules allows businesses and unions to use these basic forms of communication in a way that promotes common sense. The rule will at long last level the playing field for small businesses. Right now, the biggest corporations can exploit the system with long and costly litigation to deny workers, if they choose to do that, deny workers a fair up or down vote on joining a union. By making the election process more consistent and transparent, the board's reforms level the playing field for the smaller businesses that already play fair. So the NLRB, the board itself, the representation role is in need of just kind of basic updates. There haven't been substantial updates to this NLRB election process since the 1970s. And today, that leads to inefficiencies and delays. Right now, big corporations take advantage of those inefficiencies to postpone and even deny workers the right to vote on union representation. Often, in the face of employer tactics, workers give up hope. In fact, 1 in 3 will never even get to have an election. That's not something that the National Labor Relations Act intended. I don't think that's what anyone intends when it comes to these elections or the possibility of an election. So these amendments, these updates, these modernization reforms help restore balance and fairness to the election process. So I'm perplexed why this is the subject of so much controversy, because these are basic reforms to help people exercise their right to vote in the workplace, which is consistent with our values, consistent with our history, and also consistent with our efforts not just to move that worker and his or her family forward and their business forward, but also to move the American economy and the middle class forward. Mr. President, with that, I would yield the floor.